My greedy mother-in-law tricked my husband into selling my house, but she lost all the money in gambling and then demanded more. When I refused, she locked me in the basement. That's when I decided to seek revenge and leave the house. My name is Evelyn, and I'm 30 years old. I always believed my life was headed in the right direction. My husband, Ryan, and I worked hard for years to build something we could call our own. We saved every penny we earned, cut back on luxuries, and poured our hearts into creating a life that felt secure and fulfilling. Our small home wasn't anything extraordinary, but it was our dream, our safe haven. I can still remember how proud Ryan and I felt when we finally moved in. We painted the walls ourselves, picked out every piece of furniture with care, and made plans for our future together. For the first time, life felt steady. We weren't wealthy, but we were happy. We dreamed of starting a family, traveling, and building a future that would grow brighter with time. But that perfect vision of life was short-lived. Margaret, my mother-in-law, had other plans. She was the kind of person who always seemed to have a hidden agenda, even when she acted sweet. Margaret had a way of twisting situations to benefit herself, and unfortunately, Ryan often fell for her charms. I didn't want to believe it at first, but her true nature became harder to ignore with each passing day. One evening, Margaret came to Ryan with what she called an important family plan. I wasn't part of that conversation, of course. Margaret rarely included me in discussions about the family, as if I wasn't part of it. When Ryan finally told me what she had proposed, my heart sank. Margaret wanted us to sell her home. She claimed it would be for the family's benefit, saying the money could be used to create something bigger and better for all of us. I couldn't believe it. Ryan, this is our home. We worked so hard for it. Why would we give it up? I asked, my voice trembling. She made some good points, Evelyn, Ryan replied, his voice unsure but hopeful. Mom says this could help us in the long run. It's not just about us. It's about everyone. I argued, pleaded, and tried to make him see sense, but Margaret's words had already planted seeds of doubt in his mind. Against my wishes, the house was sold. I felt helpless, like a stranger in my own life, watching as everything we had worked for was taken away. Margaret had promised the money would be used wisely, but those promises were just words. Instead of helping the family, she spent it all on herself, fancy clothes, lavish dinners, and even gambling trips. Meanwhile, Ryan and I were forced to move into a small, rented house. It was a far cry from the life we had built, and every corner of that tiny space reminded me of what we had lost. I tried to keep my feelings to myself. Ryan was already stressed, and I didn't want to add to his burden. I told myself that maybe things would get better, that maybe Margaret would realize the damage she had caused. But deep down, I knew better. Margaret was never one to take responsibility for her actions. Our days in the rented house were hard. The walls were thin, the space was cramped, and every little thing reminded me of how much we had sacrificed. I worked long hours to make sure we could afford our bills, while Margaret continued to live her extravagant lifestyle, completely ignoring the consequences of her actions. I kept quiet for Ryan's sake, but my silence came at a cost. Every time I saw Margaret, my anger grew. Every time I heard about her spending or her schemes, I felt the weight of betrayal all over again. I wanted to stand up to her, to make her see what she had done to us, but I held back. I thought keeping the peace was more important. But peace wasn't something Margaret understood. She thrived on control, and when she saw that we were struggling, she found new ways to manipulate us. Just a few weeks after we moved, Margaret showed up at our doorstep with a new plan. This time, she wasn't asking for help. She was demanding it. She had lost everything in gambling and claimed she needed more money to fix things. She spun wild stories about how this time it would be different, how this time it was for the greater good. But I wasn't falling for it anymore. No, Margaret, I said, standing my ground for the first time. I kept quiet for Ryan's sake, but I won't do it again. You've taken enough from us. I can't help you. Margaret's face twisted in anger, her sweet mask slipping away. You think you can say no to me? She hissed, her voice low and threatening. You'll regret this, Evelyn. For the first time, I felt real fear. Margaret wasn't just manipulative, she was dangerous. But I had no idea just how far she would go to get what she wanted. Margaret's threats lingered in the air long after she stormed out of our house. I could still hear her venomous words echoing in my mind, each one sharper than the last. But for once, I didn't back down. I told myself I'd made the right decision. Margaret had already destroyed so much of our lives, and I couldn't let her take any more. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that her anger wasn't just talk. Margaret had always been the type to take drastic measures when things didn't go her way, and now she had nothing left to lose. For the next few days, I tried to carry on as if everything was normal, but her shadow seemed to follow me everywhere. Ryan, unaware of the confrontation, was preoccupied with work. I wanted to tell him what had happened, but I knew he wouldn't take my side. He always believed Margaret's excuses, no matter how many times she let us down. He would brush it off as a misunderstanding, and I didn't have the energy to argue. So, I stayed quiet, hoping the storm would pass. One evening, Ryan left for a business trip. As he stood by the door, ready to leave, I considered telling him about Margaret's threats. But I hesitated. I didn't want to spark a fight right before he left. "Be careful," I said instead, forcing a smile as he kissed me goodbye. As his car disappeared down the street, a wave of unease settled over me. The house felt too quiet, too still. I tried to distract myself with chores, but every creak of the floorboards made me jump. I locked all the doors and double-checked the windows, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Hours passed, and just as I started to relax, a loud knock echoed through the house. My heart sank. I didn't need to look to know who it was. Margaret stood on the porch, her expression cold and determined. "We need to talk," she said, pushing past me before I could respond. "Margaret, it's late," I started, but she wasn't listening. She paced the living room, her movements quick and agitated. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" she snapped, her voice rising. "You think you can just say no to me and everything will be fine?" "I've had enough, Margaret," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You've already taken so much from us. I won't let you ruin what little we have left." Her eyes narrowed, and before I could react, she grabbed my arm. "You don't get to make that decision," she hissed, dragging me toward the basement door. "What are you doing?" I yelled, struggling to free myself, but her grip was iron-tight. She shoved me down the stairs. I stumbled, barely catching myself before I fell. The door slammed shut behind me, and I heard the click of the lock. "Maybe some time down there will remind you who's in charge," she called through the door, her voice dripping with mockery. The cellar was dark and cold, the kind of place that made your skin crawl. I banged on the door, yelling for her to let me out, but my voice only echoed back at me. Margaret's footsteps retreated, and soon the house fell silent. Hours passed, each one dragging on endlessly. I huddled in a corner, shivering as the temperature dropped. The air was damp, and the faint smell of mildew made it hard to breathe. My stomach twisted with hunger, but the fear was worse. I kept thinking about what Margaret might do next. Would she leave me here overnight? For days? Or was she planning something even worse? At some point, the door creaked open. Margaret stood there, holding a flashlight that cast long, eerie shadows across the walls. "You look pathetic," she sneered, stepping closer. "Maybe now you'll learn not to mess with me." Before I could respond, she raised a wooden stick and struck me. Pain shot through my arm as I tried to shield myself. "Stop it, Margaret!" I screamed, but she didn't stop. She hit me again. And again. Each blow sent waves of pain through my body until I could barely move. "I'll let you out when you're ready to cooperate," she said, her voice calm as if she hadn't just attacked me. She locked the door again and disappeared upstairs. I don't know how long I sat there in the dark, my body aching and my mind racing. I thought about Ryan, about how he always defended Margaret no matter what she did. Would he believe me this time? Or would he find a way to excuse her behavior again? I couldn't let her win. I didn't know how, but I promised myself I would find a way out of this. Margaret had pushed me too far, and I wasn't going to let her destroy my life any further. When the morning light crept through the cracks of the cellar, I felt a renewed sense of determination. My body was bruised, but my will to fight back was stronger than ever. I couldn't let Margaret get away with this. I had to find a way to expose her, not just to Ryan, but to everyone who had blindly trusted her over the years. I tried the cellar door again, pushing and pulling with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. Hours passed, and my frustration grew. Finally, I heard Ryan's car pulling into the driveway. Relief washed over me as I started yelling for him, banging on the walls as loudly as I could. "Evelyn!" Ryan's voice called from upstairs. Moments later, the cellar door unlocked, and he stood there, his face full of confusion. "What's going on? Why are you down here?" I stumbled out, holding onto the railing for support. "It's Margaret," I said, my voice shaky but firm. "She locked me down here. She hit me, Ryan. She's gone too far this time." Ryan's face twisted in disbelief. "Mom? No, Evelyn, you've got it all wrong. She wouldn't do something like that." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Look at me," I shouted, pulling up my sleeve to reveal the bruises. "Do you think I did this to myself?" But Ryan just shook his head, his loyalty to Margaret blinding him. "I don't know what's going on, but Mom isn't capable of this. She's not a bad person, Evelyn." Those words hit harder than any of Margaret's blows. I realized then that Ryan would never take my side. He was too tied to his mother, too willing to believe her lies, no matter the cost. That night, I made a decision. If Ryan wasn't going to stand by me, I would take matters into my own hands. I started going through every piece of information I could find, bank statements, emails, and even the messages Margaret had sent Ryan over the months. It didn't take long to uncover the truth. Margaret had used the money from our house sale to pay off massive gambling debts and fund her extravagant lifestyle. But that wasn't all. She had also forged Ryan's signature to take out a loan in our name, leaving us responsible for her reckless spending. The lies ran deeper than I had imagined. Armed with evidence, I waited for the right moment. Margaret returned the next day, acting as if nothing had happened. She smiled sweetly at Ryan, pretending to be the loving mother she never truly was. "Mom, we need to talk," I said, stepping into the living room with a folder of documents in hand. Ryan and Margaret both turned to look at me, their expressions unreadable. "What is this?" Margaret asked, her voice sharp. "This is the truth," I replied, throwing the papers onto the coffee table. "Your lies, your gambling debts, the forged loan. It's all here, Margaret. You've been manipulating us from the start." Margaret's face paled, but she quickly regained her composure. "Ryan, don't listen to her," she said, her voice trembling. "She's trying to tear this family apart." But Ryan picked up the papers, his hands shaking as he read through them. For the first time, I saw doubt in his eyes. "Mom, is this true?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret opened her mouth to deny it, but the evidence was undeniable. Her lies unraveled before us, and there was nowhere left for her to hide. I called the police that evening, determined to hold Margaret accountable for everything she had done. Watching her being led away in handcuffs was both heartbreaking and liberating. I had loved Ryan, but his blind trust in Margaret had destroyed our marriage. I knew I couldn't stay with someone who refused to see the truth. Margaret was charged with multiple counts of fraud and assault. The court proceedings were long and exhausting, but in the end, justice was served. She was sentenced to prison, leaving her isolated and bankrupt, just as she had left us. After everything settled, I moved out of the rented house and started over. I found a small apartment, threw myself into work, and slowly began to rebuild my life. It wasn't easy, but with time, I saved enough money to buy my own home. This time, it was truly mine, built on my hard work and determination. I also started a business, pouring all my energy into something I could call my own. It took years of effort, but the business thrived, bringing me a sense of pride and independence I had never felt before. Margaret had tried to destroy me, but in the end, her actions only made me stronger. I learned to stand up for myself, to fight for what I deserved. And now, as I look around at the life I've built, I know one thing for certain: I will never let anyone take it away from me again.